Just remember when you're standing in the valley of decision and the adversary says give in, just hold on. Our Lord will show up and He will take you through the fire again.
The cause of Colonel Dixon Miles' historical reputation as negligent in the management of the defense of Harper's Ferry in September 1862 is plainly, in the first instance, the decision of Major General John Wool, made on September 2, 1862, to hold the place, despite the impending movement of the Confederate Army across the Potomac into Maryland. It is plain from the record that on August 28, when General Wool was informed that Stonewall Jackson had appeared at Manassas Junction on August 27 and had sacked the place, he recognized the probability that Pope would fumble in the attempt to destroy Jackson before the remainder of Lee's army could come up to his support, and that the consequence would be Lee's movement of his army into Maryland, that is, to Frederick. This was the moment that, despite General Halleck's recommendation that garrison at Harper's Ferry remove itself to Elk Ridge on the north bank of the Potomac, General Wool decided to expressly order Colonel Miles to hold possession of Harper's Ferry to, as he put it, the last extremity. The reason he made this decision is the fact that he had an intimate, if not financial, relationship with John Garrett, the president of the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad, and Garrett wanted the Potomac Railroad Bridge protected, as Garrett and his stockholders had just spent a considerable sum of money rebuilding the bridge and did not want the investment lost. When Wool issued to Colonel Miles his hold to the last extremity order, Wool knew Miles had available for defense of the ferry only 3 regiments with combat experience: the 32nd Ohio, 60th Ohio, and the 39th New York. These regiments had been part of Milroy's division and were engaged more or less in the Union attack on Jackson's lines at Cross Keys in June. Supporting these were 3 regiments: 9th Vermont, 65th Illinois, and the 87th Ohio, that had been on picket duty at different points on the railroad for 2 months, but which had seen no action. Supplementing these regiments was the 1st Maryland Home Guard, which by its term of service was restricted to operations in Maryland, and some companies of the 3rd Maryland Home Guard, composed of men from West Virginia and commanded by a 22-year-old lawyer named Robert Downey. To these, in the period between August 28 and September 4, Wool added 4 New York regiments of raw recruits: the 111th, the 115th, the 125th, and the 126th New York. The regiments arriving by rail cars without rifles or ammunition. Of these 12 regiments, few of them had lieutenant colonels present for duty, and only one of the colonels was a career soldier. The rest were all Republican politicians who had formed their regiments in their respective states. 2 additional New York regiments, the 22nd and the 12th, were at the ferry on August 28, but the 22nd enlistment period had expired, and by the time Lee's army was crossing the Potomac on September 4, the regiment had been returned to New York City. The 12th's period of enlistment had also expired, but with the Confederates then across the river, the men of the regiment elected to hunker down at Camp Hill and refused to bear arms. When General Wool decided to hold Harper's Ferry with this constellation of troops, he was well aware of the key vulnerability of the place. There are four interrelated features of the ground that a body of troops attempting to maintain its position in Harper's Ferry must control. First is the primary bastion known as Camp Hill, a 500-foot hill that rises between the lower town and the ridge of Bolivar Heights, that runs east and west between the Potomac and the Shenandoah, forming the base of a triangle, with the apex being the railroad bridge at the edge of the lower town and Camp Hill situated in the middle. In the months preceding, a substantial line of fortification had been constructed along the southern slope of Camp Hill with embrasures for the placement of artillery. Along with the raw New York troops, General Wool had two 20-pounder paired guns shipped by cars to the ferry for placement in these embrasures. Second is a 3-gun battery in place on a shelf about 600 feet in elevation on the western slope of Elk Ridge. Two of the guns were 9-inch Dahlgren guns, the gun tubes of which weigh 9,000 pounds. The third gun was a 50-pounder Parrott rifle that was placed on the east end of the battery facing Loudon Heights, a mountain that rises to 1,000 feet in elevation across from Camp Hill on the east side of the Shenandoah River. The two Dahlgren guns' lines of fire were aimed directly at Camp Hill. These guns could throw a shell some 4 or 5 miles, depending upon elevation and the strength of the charge, providing a curtain of protection to the troops on Camp Hill against an infantry attempting to cross the saddle of ground between that place and the ridge of Bolivar Heights. Third is Bolivar Heights, a ridge rising in elevation some 600 feet from the valley that separates it from Schoolhouse Ridge a mile to the south. Running north and south over Boulevard Heights is a pike that crosses the valley, passes through Halltown, and goes on to Charleston some 5 miles further to the west. Fourth is Loudon Heights. In 1861, the Confederates, then occupying the ferry, had cut down a swath of forest that crowned the heights opposite the ferry for a distance of some 300 yards. Doing this with the intent of creating a field of fire for troops and artillery placed in fortifications at the northern end of the mountain overlooking the Potomac bridges in Pleasant Valley, a narrow valley lying between Elk Ridge and South Mountain. General Wool had visited Harper's Ferry in June and July, and though he was 78 years old and probably did not personally go onto either Elk Ridge or Loudon Heights, he certainly stood on Boulevard Heights and on Camp Hill. And from these locations, given his long military experience dating back to the War of 1812, most certainly appreciated the obvious vulnerability of the place. Because the ridgeline of Boulevard Heights is about 1.5 miles in length, it would be unlikely that an infantry force of, say, 8,000 men, over half of whom are without any military training, much less experience, could hold the line against a superior, experienced force for long. Therefore, at some point in the defense of the place, the necessity would probably arise for the defense force to retreat to the bastion of Camp Hill and there make a stand against enemy attacks, using the artillery in place in the fortification and counting on the Dahlgren guns to rain shells down on the enemy attempting to cross the saddle between the hill and the ridge. In this latter circumstance, General Wool certainly understood if the enemy appeared with artillery on the crown of Loudon Heights and opened a barrage on Camp Hill, the only way to suppress the fire was with a 50-pounder parrot in place at the naval battery on the shelf of Elk Ridge. Whether it was practical to bring the Dahlgren guns' fire to bear on the enemy artillery on Loudon Heights depended upon the nature of the carriages in use to support them, and the exact nature of these is not known. Whether it was only the parrot or all three of the guns concentrating their fire on Loudon Heights, if the naval battery was seized by the enemy, Wool knew the defense of Camp Hill would become untenable because the enemy batteries firing down on it from Loudon Heights would compel the defenders to crawl into the earth as deeply as they could, giving the enemy infantry opportunity to cross the saddle without the Dahlgren guns impeding their attack, and the combination would eventually overpower the ability of the defensive force holding the hill to resist. How to juggle these four military factors was the problem General Wool's decision dumped into Colonel Miles' hands. One possibility of reconciling these factors was to concentrate the defensive efforts on protecting the naval battery from enemy capture, thus ensuring that not only would the Union force concentrated at Camp Hill be supported by its fire, but also its fire would be available to suppress enemy artillery from barraging Camp Hill from Loudon Heights. But how to do this, given the fact that the enemy could approach the naval battery from both the direction of Solomon's Gap, some 4 miles north of the battery on Elk Ridge, and from the direction of Maryland Heights at the south end of Elk Ridge. Given the configuration of Solomon's Gap, it was possible for Colonel Miles to place 2 or more pieces of artillery at the west mouth of the gap, directing fire through it toward the east. These guns, supported by infantry, and infantry might easily take position on the north and south shoulders of the gap and provide plunging volley fire on enemy infantry attempting to reach the gap by the road coming up the mountain from Pleasant Valley. But Colonel Miles was an intelligent, experienced soldier, and thus he knew doing this was not feasible. For the simple reason the force deployed at the gap could not be supported. The gap being some 4 miles north of the fortifications in front of the naval battery on the shelf above the Potomac, and the enemy could gain the crown of the mountain at Maryland Heights by use of a rough road that came up the east flank of the mountain from Sandy Hook. On August 28, as Pope was converging his scattered corps upon Manassas Junction, General Wool had obviously spent time that day going over the map of the Ferry, pondering the defensive problems, and he hit upon the idea of having a blockhouse built on the east side of Maryland Heights where the road from the valley climbs out, sending a 50-year-old volunteer officer named Robert S. Rogers, who in his youth had practiced engineering, to supervise the construction. But Miles, he says, rejected the idea as impractical, preferring to use what labor force he had available to open a field of fire in front of the naval battery and to throw up a line of breastworks on the summit of the mountain above Maryland Heights to resist the advance of an enemy force coming south from the gap. The crisis unfolding from these events materialized 10 days later when 8 Confederate regiments ascended the road leading to the gap, drove off the Union pickets who retired to a line of skirmishers who exchanged rifle fire with the Confederates through the day of September 12th. The opposing forces sleeping in the woods the night of the 12th, about a mile north of the Union breastworks, which had been thrown up across the crown of the mountain, a half mile or so in front of what they called the lookout, a stone structure that had been constructed at the 1,600-foot elevation of the mountain. The Union breastworks were manned by the Raw Regiment of the 126th New York and a number of companies belonging to the 32nd Ohio, supported on the eastern flank of the mountain by a number of companies of the 3rd Maryland Home Guard under the command of 22-year-old Stephen Downey, the West Virginia lawyer. From dawn on the 13th to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this Union force, reinforced from time to time by companies of the 39th New York and companies of the 60th Ohio, engaged in continuous skirmishing with Confederates whose lines advanced slowly but persistently forward through the woods, their flanks extending down the slopes of the mountain, with their left wing moving Indian file along a narrow rock shelf to gain the road coming up from Sandy Hook. And the pressure of this caused eventually Downey's Marylanders to give way, while almost at the same time several companies of the 126th New York, holding the center of the breastworks, lost their composure when the regiment's colonel was shot down and the chain of command of the whole force disintegrated, with Downey riding aimlessly back and forth between the heights and the naval battery, and the majors, now in command of the 32nd Ohio and 126th New York, unable to coordinate the actions of the regiments as a whole, and a general retreat from the summit resulted. The Union men being prevented from turning the retreat into a rout by Colonel Miles, who appeared, and by the threat of deadly force, got some semblance of control of the troops and got them back into line in front of the battery, where the battle then became focused. Miles then returned to Boulevard Heights, where, by that time, the mass of Jackson's troops were beginning to appear, brigade by brigade, on the eastern slope of Schoolhouse Ridge. Here, Miles conferred with Lincoln's brigadier, Julius White, whose brigade of regiments, along with the raw New York regiments, were entrenched along the ridge of Boulevard Heights with 3 artillery batteries. While the two officers were talking, a man named Ford, an Ohio politician, and now colonel of the 32nd Ohio, who was in command of the force defending the naval battery, decided the Confederate force in his front was about to sweep over his troops, and he ordered a general retreat, in the course of which he had the Dahlgren guns and the Parrott gun dismounted and thrown over the edge of the shelf. Seeing Ford's troops streaming down the road from the naval battery to the river road, Miles and White both knew their fallback position to Camp Hill was now untenable, as there was no means now of suppressing Confederate artillery fire from Loudoun Heights. Their choice of action was now reduced to 2 alternatives: either surrender or accept the casualties that would be incurred by offering resistance to the enemy's ultimate infantry attack. During the night of the 13th and through the day and into the evening of the 14th, the Union regiments remained in position on and behind Boulevard Heights, with 2 of White's 3 experienced regiments manning breastwork, supporting 2 of White's 3 batteries along the pike to the point it crosses the ridge, and passes into the valley beyond. The third of these regiments, the 39th New York, along with the 65th Illinois and the Raw New York Volunteer Regiments, was in position along the ridge itself, facing towards Schoolhouse Ridge. Wife's 3rd Battery was divided into sections and placed between them. By nightfall on the 14th, under cover of the artillery fire from Loudon Heights and Confederate battery fire and action in the valley, the regiments of A.P. Hill's division had advanced from the bluffs overlooking the Shenandoah River westward through the wooded, rugged ravines, skirmishing with Downey's Marylanders and pushing them from the woods. By darkness, Hill's men were massed along the Union front from the Pike's intersection with the ridge northward to the sloping open ground of Murphy's Farm, the men laying down for the night some 400 yards from the Union breastworks, just at the edge of canister range. Contrary to the storyline the historian cliques offer their audiences, what Colonel Miles and General White expected would happen in the morning is far from clear. Whether White had the brains to comprehend the military situation Stonewall Jackson was confronted with, we can reasonably assume Dixon Miles had a sense of it. Though on paper, counting regiments and brigades, it appears the 10 Union regiments were facing more than twice their numbers. Miles knew the march Jackson's men had made from Richmond to Manassas must have taken a toll, and the 2 days of general battle at Manassas certainly had reduced the men present for duty in the regiments further. Adding to this, the probability much straggling occurred when the Confederate Army crossed the Potomac. Miles, as any reasonable person in his circumstances, with his experience as a soldier, must have realized the number of men in the companies of Jackson's regiments might be now no more than 30% of their full complement. Given this probable fact, Miles must have recognized that the experienced core of the Union force, the 32nd and 60th Ohio, along with the 39th New York, might be supported sufficiently by the 7 raw regiments, the 9th Vermont, 65th Illinois, the New York Volunteers, and the Marylanders, supported in turn by canister fire from the Union guns, to effectuate a repulse of the enemy infantry attack expected to occur in the morning. But the experience of giving orders to Michigan volunteers at Bull Run, which had taken him to a court of inquiry and public chastisement, certainly would have discouraged him from assuming the experience would be any different dealing with White than it had been dealing with Richardson. By this time, Miles would have known White for what he was, an insurance salesman who, with Lincoln's political endorsement, had been made a general on paper, no backbone in his spine and no ability to command a regiment in his brain, much less a brigade in battle. If Colonel Miles, being the ostensible military commander of the Union force, were to order General White to energize the colonels of his regiments, Utassi of the 39th, Trumbull of the 60th Ohio, Ford and his junior officers of the 32nd Ohio, and standard of the 9th Vermont, to bring their men to the mark, to hold their line at the pike. Would White do it? If Miles were to order the colonels of the raw New York regiments to form their men in support of White's regiments and come forward in the heat of battle to fill the gaps in the Union line that Confederate fire had caused, would they do it? Given the testimony of General White and his colonels at the commission hearing after the event, it is plain beyond dispute that the answer is that White would not have executed Colonel Miles' order. White would have asserted his superior rank and would have claimed the right to take command of the Union force, and he would have used the excuse of the exhaustion of long-range artillery ammunition to justify surrendering, rather than order the colonels under his command to bring their men to the mark and stand and fight until physically overpowered by the weight of the Confederate infantry attack. What fault there is, then, in the surrender? The record shows the fault lies with White, not Miles. Given the timing of the surrender on the 15th, we can wonder whether Jackson would have given Hill the order to attack the Union front. Jackson had spent the entire day of the 14th, as well as the night of the 14th, bringing artillery batteries into action along the front of Bolivar Heights and on the crown of Loudon Heights and on the flat land between the mountain and the Shenandoah River, increasing the artillery barrage through the day and opening it again at first light, which came at 4:30 a.m. on the 15th. At this time, the men of the regiments of Hill's division were ready to spring up from the ground and run forward over the 400 yards of open space that separated them from the Union infantry line, being blasted in Jackson's mind by canister, which would tear into the charging men, causing great carnage, reducing the already thin ranks of his men. And it would have been far from certain in Jackson's mind that when the two forces collided at the pike and a general melee ensued, the volleying back and forth, the bayonets, the hand-to-hand combat, that the Union lines would be broken and splintered and the fight given up. By first light, too, Jackson would have known that the Confederate left wing was retreating from the South Mountain toward Sharpsburg and the Potomac River ford, and that to commit his wing to an engagement then might result in being confronted with McClellan's divisions arriving at the ferry, forcing him into a confused effort to effectuate a retreat. And even if the most rosy view of the tactical situation were adopted, still the Confederate attack would cause the loss of men that would so reduce the strength of the regiments that bringing them to battle at Sharpsburg would no longer be an option. And so the record shows that instead of launching the infantry attack at first light, using the fog that blanketed the river valley to delay the opening of the Union canister fire until the gunners could see the emerging figures of men running toward them, Jackson's men did not move. As the hours passed, 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 8 a.m., These 4 hours passed with only the batteries in action. Jackson waiting. For what? And then, the last moment, General White orchestrated his council of war and his yes men, the colonels of his regiments, endorsed without dissent his recommendation that with the exhaustion of the long-range ammunition, the last extremity had been reached and there was nothing to do. No time left but to surrender.